Today is March 3rd, 2024. The conflict in Ukraine continues. I want to begin by looking at the live map. This is liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian live map. We can look at the line of contact. We've heard about incidents along the Dnieper River here in Kherson. Ukrainian forces trying and failing to cross the Dnieper River. That has been an ongoing struggle for them. Has not resulted in any success, not even PR success. Along the line of contact, we see Russian forces, especially around Avdeevka, west of Avdeevka, continuing to seize territory from retreating Ukrainian forces. We remember that Russian forces took all of Avdeevka, and now they have taken all of these towns and villages west of Avdeevka, and Ukrainians are trying to find a defensive position where they can stop this advance. And all along the line of contact, we have been seeing the use of Russian military aviation. I will get into claims. You can see here daily claims by Ukraine that they are downing Russian Su-34 bomber aircraft. I'll get into that in a moment. I want to zoom out though for a moment and show you this. Drone damage to residential homes in St. Petersburg. Now, we've seen attacks like this from Ukraine over the last 2 years, targeting civilian targets in Crimea, Moscow, St. Petersburg. We have seen this repeatedly. And we remember the Western media and articles like this. I've gone over articles like this. This was from August 2023. Kiev's drone strikes on Moscow mean Kremlin's war can't be ignored by Russians. And despite the headline, you scroll down to the end of the article, it admits. Down here, they're talking about these strikes and says, yet the documented psychological impact, they're talking about on Russians so far, has been dubious, with polling indicating little shift in the way Russians feel about the war. And anecdotal evidence from psychologists and reports by journalists showing that many Russians have simply decided to ignore the attacks. These are superficial attacks. They do cause damage. They're infrequent. They have not created any sort of significant tactical or even strategic damage. And Russia is a very big place, so people are going to get used to this. That is what the article is saying. They've gotten used to this and they're essentially ignoring it. So why is Ukraine carrying out these strikes? Just to prove that they can hit Russia, not to prove anything to Russia. They're irrelevant as far as Russia is concerned. It's meant to convince the Ukrainian people that somehow they're still able to fight and achieve some sort of victory in this conflict. But this is a substitute for actual victory. So I was talking about Ukrainian forces withdrawing from around villages near Avdeevka. This is from Reuters. This was from February 28, 2024. Ukraine's military said that had withdrawn from 2 villages near the eastern town of Avdeevka, which was captured earlier this month. They mean early February, but Russian forces losing more territory as support from Western allies runs out. So they're blaming a lack of support from Western allies for this loss of territory to Russian forces. It also says, they're quoting a Ukrainian military spokesperson, Ukraine was pulling back to positions level with the rest of the Eastern Front line to terrain more suitable for defense. But I have to say that Avdeevka was one of the most heavily fortified positions Ukraine held along the line of contact. There is no terrain more suitable for defense. Maybe what they mean is because they have been forced out of Avdeevka, the terrain immediately around Avdeevka is not suitable for defense, so they need to fall back fast enough to outpace Russian advances, prepare defenses, dig in, and then at least stop Russian forces from moving any further. And as this has taken place, as Ukrainian forces were driven out of Avdeevka and as they continue losing ground, we can see panic setting in Ukraine, in Kiev, but also among Ukraine's Western backers. So we are seeing articles and talk about this. NATO allies reject Emmanuel Macron's idea of troops to Ukraine. This was from 3 days ago. It says several NATO countries, including the US, Germany, and the UK, have ruled out deploying ground troops to Ukraine after French President Emmanuel Macron said nothing should be excluded. Mr. Macron said there was no consensus on sending Western soldiers to Ukraine. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov has warned of direct conflict if NATO troops deploy there. Russian forces have recently made gains in Ukraine, and Kiev has urgently appealed for more weapons. So there's this shortage of artillery shells, of air defense missiles, of long-range missiles to send Ukraine to strike at Russian targets far behind the line of contact. This is because there is a fundamental shortage of all of these arms and ammunition. The West simply does not make enough. They have emptied out their stockpiles, transferred it over to Ukraine. Ukraine has expended it. It has not made any difference. They continue to lose the conflict. If NATO troops were to go into Ukraine, they would be going into Ukraine with what artillery? With what artillery shells? With what air defenses? With what long-range missiles to strike at Russian targets? Now, the only thing that NATO would have that would be an advantage that they really cannot transfer over to Ukraine is air power. NATO has a significant amount of air power. They could go in to Ukraine. They could use this air power. If a conflict broke out between these NATO forces and Russian forces, I think it would take a huge toll out on NATO forces. And whether they were successful or not, they would be tied up in Ukraine. This air power would now be off the board in terms of the conflict between the US and China. The United States, and by extent its allies, are painting themselves into a corner. This conflict is consuming all of their time, energy, and resources. They have very little left for this other war they would also like to pursue with China, a very similar war they're trying to provoke with China, especially in the Asia-Pacific region. So this is not a viable option. It's extremely dangerous. It's extremely desperate. But the fact that they're talking about it shows just how desperate and thus dangerous all of NATO, led by the United States, has become. Now, speaking of these shortages, we have this from CNN, February 28, 2024. Pentagon considering tapping last source of Ukraine military funding as Congress stalls on additional aid. Now, as I have pointed out repeatedly, this isn't about a lack of money. It is about a physical lack of ammunition, of weapons, of vehicles to send Ukraine. This is what CNN says. The Pentagon is weighing whether to tap into the last remaining source of funding it has for military aid to support Ukraine's war effort against Russia, even without guarantees that those funds will be replenished by Congress, multiple defense officials told CNN. The Defense Department still has around $4 billion in Presidential Drawdown Authority funds available for Ukraine, which allows the Pentagon to draw from its own stockpiles to send military equipment to Kiev. No decisions have been made yet, officials emphasized, but the conversations about the option and other potential plan Bs have become increasingly urgent over the last several weeks as the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine has become more dire. The officials said Ukrainian troops have been forced to ration ammunition and have lost some ground in the east, including the key city of Avdeevka, which fell to the Russians earlier this month, and by that they mean February. Of course, again, the problem is a lack of physical ammunition, arms, vehicles, and also manpower. Ukraine is suffering a manpower shortage, trained manpower shortage. Money cannot solve any of these shortages. You have to expand your military industrial base, which takes years to do. It's not something that can be done overnight, no matter how much money you apply. CNN also says the last Ukraine security package worth up to 250 million US dollars was announced on December 27. Some weapons and equipment from previous drawdown packages and Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative packages are still flowing into Ukraine, but the US has not announced any new packages since then. And the reason is it's not because of the money. It's because there is not enough to scrape together to put into a package. Maybe by the time they come to some sort of agreement on the funding, they will have scraped together enough to put into an additional package. It continues. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky told CNN this week that Ukraine will not win the war without continued U.S. support. Ukraine will not win the war, period. People will be prepared, but ammunition, that's the problem. People are not prepared. That is the problem. Even if they had the ammunition, they don't have the people. But the ammunition will not be prepared and brigades will not be ready. Not only for our counteroffensive, they will not be ready to defend, to stay strong. It will be very difficult, he said. So I have done a recent video about aggressive attrition, Russian aggressive attrition. This is the predicted outcome that I myself and other analysts have been talking about over the last 2 years. This is what Russia was trying to achieve, not territorial gains, but the destruction of Ukraine's military, the depletion of not only its own means of making war, but also NATO's. And it was a patient, persistent strategy, and now we see it finally paying off. This is the end result. And by the way, when they talk about the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, that was because there was not enough in existing stockpiles of any system or any type of ammunition. They had to actually draw up contracts with manufacturers to make it and then send it to Ukraine. That is what they were referring to. And for people that have followed my analysis over the last 2 years, I used to go over every single Pentagon package to Ukraine. And I showed how it went from drawdowns from existing stockpiles and how it gradually shifted to most of the equipment and ammunition being these contracts where they had to be made and then sent to Ukraine. This could take weeks, could take months, could even take years to fulfill these orders. Another very predictable outcome that I myself and others warned about. This is from Wall Street Journal. Ukraine plunders howitzer graveyard to keep big guns firing. Concern rise over Ukraine's ability to maintain weapons crucial for the fight against Russia. Now, in a previous update, I talked about how the US Department of Defense itself admitted they did not have a sustainment and maintenance plan for the equipment they sent to Ukraine. The M1 Abrams tanks, the Patriot missile air defense system, Strykers, Bradleys, they sent this complex equipment to Ukraine. They had no plan to help Ukraine maintain it or sustain it on the battlefield. And I talked before the first of any of these pieces of equipment were sent to Ukraine, how difficult, if not impossible, it would be for Ukraine to use these effectively on the battlefield. Now the US Department of Defense admits it, and now they're talking about howitzers, which I also warned about. Before the first M777 appeared on the Ukrainian battlefield, I talked about how difficult it would be to maintain and sustain these guns. This is what the Wall Street Journal says. At a repair base in Ukraine, mechanics patched together Western artillery guns using parts scavenged from the battered carcasses of some 20 damaged howitzers scattered outside. The need to create such Franken guns comes after 2 years of war that have meant many of the weapons donated by the West are now destroyed, damaged, or in need of new components. Ukraine is on the defensive after Russian forces recently took the eastern city of Avdeevka. So it's not a lack of ammunition, it's also a lack of weapons because Russia is systematically destroying these weapons. They have been grinding down Ukrainian military capabilities for the last 2 years, and the West simply cannot replace it faster than Russia can damage or destroy it. It continues. It says, the U.S. and its allies are increasingly concerned about Ukraine's ability to sustain its stocks of Western weaponry on the battlefield. Maintaining weapons is crucial for Kiev's fight amid uncertainty over future U.S. military aid and as Russia increases its arms production, something that the Western media had tried to deny for well over at least a year. Now only recently they're admitting to finally. I also talked about the difficulty of repairing these weapons, that Ukrainians would never be able to repair these weapons themselves. They would have to be shipped out of the country because any maintenance facility of any significance inside Ukraine would be found by Russian forces and taken out with cruise missiles or drones, long-range cruise missiles or long-range drones. These facilities have to be outside of Ukraine, meaning that broken down artillery piece, tank, infantry fighting vehicle, armored personnel carrier, all of this equipment would have to be shipped 1,000 kilometers or more outside of Ukraine repaired, and then shipped back, meaning it could be off the front line for weeks, maybe even months, depending on what's wrong with it and how quickly it can be turned around. The article says Ukraine operates a variety of different Western weapon systems whose components aren't always interchangeable. I've talked about this also endlessly, about the lack of standardization, the fact that Ukraine has multiple types of main battle tanks, not just one type that they have to figure out how to maintain, sustain, and operate, but a multitude of them. They're not standardized. They cannot use the same ammunition. They don't have the same engines, the same optics, the same fire control. And this is the same with virtually every system Ukraine is using on the battlefield. And now the Wall Street Journal is admitting this. Engineers said they haven't received a steady flow of parts from the West. Spares from the US are provided via aid packages, meaning if new funding agreements aren't reached, the flow of American parts could dry up. In response, Ukraine is making its own spares for Western equipment and cannibalizing other weapons to source vital components. To help, some foreign arms companies plan to start conducting repairs in Ukraine to reduce time-consuming travel. Yet, no details of that were shared by the article itself. I've not heard any report where the details of how they would do this are spelled out. They have repeatedly said they will do this. They have repeatedly said they would set up arms factories inside Ukraine. But the reality is, while they're saying this as a form of symbolic support for Ukraine, in reality, the moment they set up a facility like this, it's going to be found, it will be targeted, and it will be destroyed. There is a reason that Ukraine has to send all of this equipment outside of Ukraine to be repaired in the first place. The article talks about the M777 howitzer specifically. It says parts from 8 different M777s plucked mainly from the damaged guns outside. They're referring to those 20-something guns sitting outside that are all damaged, have been used to refurbish one gun. Around 20% of the resurrected gun's parts have been made in Ukraine, including hoses, some gauges, and the hydraulics that reduce recoil when artillery fires. Mechanics have to be careful because the M777's lightweight titanium frame means new additions can influence the positioning of the barrel. New parts are tested with chemicals for brittleness and then given a road test on the battlefield, engineers say. They said they hope to return the howitzer to its original crew within 2 weeks of receiving it. And here we see the complications of America's over-engineered weapon systems. Yes, they're highly precise. Yes, under optimal conditions, they perform fairly well, but they're not designed for ruggedness out on the battlefield, and they're meant to be supported by a huge network of maintenance and sustainment. They did not create these networks for Ukraine. They barely got this equipment to Ukraine in the first place. The support network for this equipment is much larger than all of the equipment being sent itself. I talked about this in a previous update where the infantry, say in the US Marine Corps, make up only 15% of the fighting force. Everyone else is there to support the infantry. And so when you send M777s or howitzers or Bradleys or Strykers, you're sending that equipment. A much, much larger organization needs to be created to sustain and maintain it. A further 11 howitzers and other weapons, including Soviet-era artillery, were being fixed at the repair base. Some parts that can't be made locally are running out. Mechanics have only a few barrel temperature gauges left, while stocks of supporting gearboxes, which help position the barrel, have run dry. Engineers said they didn't receive parts from the US for several months in late 2023, though they have started to arrive again since the turn of the year. Well, they had funding back then, so where were these parts? And this suggests a much deeper problem with America's support for Ukraine, and it goes back to the fact that they didn't set up a sustainment and maintenance network when they sent this in the first place. They admittedly did not. That's where the problem is. It has nothing to do with funding. As the war stretches on, one big problem is the barrels on artillery guns. So we've talked about this often as well. These barrels run out and then you have to replace them. Where are the replacements coming from? Is the US sending enough replacements? With 2 years of shooting, they are getting worn out. One Soviet-produced armored car at the workshop has had 4 barrel changes over the course of the war. Ukraine is firing artillery guns far more than their manufacturers intended. Because again, you have to remember the M777 was designed to fight the type of wars the US had been fighting up until now. These small wars where artillery would fire a few times a day, not constantly all day, every day. They said the barrel should typically shoot 2,500 times before being replaced. Ukraine is firing it 5,000 times or more. With such overuse, barrels typically lose their accuracy and range, and then they also begin to fail, which includes exploding in the face of the crews, injuring or killing the crew. The US cannot even manufacture something simple like shells to send Ukraine in the quantities required. How are they going to manufacture something like barrels fast enough to meet Ukraine's battlefield needs? The same article admits that there's a similar problem with the German-made Leopard 2 tanks. I would imagine the same problem applies to the M1 Abrams, Stryker, Bradley, everything admitted to, again, by the US Department of Defense. And the article itself mentions this. Another challenge Ukrainian mechanics face is the variety of different Western and Soviet-era weapons in use. There are currently 14 different artillery systems alone in Ukraine's arsenal, and almost none of them are compatible. Some of them you may be able to interchangeably use the ammunition, but as far as the parts go, no, they're not interchangeable. It's a problem, said one of the mechanics, who has been working on vehicles from 4 different countries, including the US. Occasionally, he tries to take a part from one piece of Western equipment and use it in another. Sometimes I take out a part and it fits, sometimes they don't. This do-it-yourself style of repair may not always be best for the equipment. Ukrainian repairs to German tanks have sometimes made matters worse. And that was according to a German lawmaker that they were citing. The article also admits components for weapon systems are typically designed and produced precisely to a particular weight and size, then tested multiple times by their manufacturers. As such, replacing them with uncertified components could lead to problems on the battlefield, including fatal failures of these systems. This is the reality of modern warfare. It is not a movie. You cannot just repair things on the spot. In some cases you might be able to, but when we're talking about precision weapons, they need precision repair. And it's very difficult to do. It could take months to train someone regarding the basics, and then they would still need to be attached to an experienced crew working on it to learn how to actually practically repair these systems. Like I have said repeatedly, this is not something that could be done overnight. It's not something that could even be done in a year or two. It takes years for a military to integrate even a single piece of new equipment, a new type of howitzer, a new type of tank or drone. It could take years for them to fully integrate it into their fighting force and use it effectively on the battlefield. It cannot be done in 1 or 2 years, as they are trying to do. You can see how desperate the situation is in terms of the fundamentals of Ukraine's war effort, which is why Ukraine is increasingly resorting to more and more absurd propaganda. For example, this from the BBC. Ukraine war. Zelensky says 31,000 troops killed since Russia's full-scale invasion. And now, the interesting thing about this article is that as you go through it, they talk to you about Zelensky's claims, and then for the rest of the article, they're basically debunking what President Zelensky has just said. Since Vladimir Zelensky says 31,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed during Russia's full-scale invasion. The Ukrainian president said he would not give the number of wounded, as that would help Russian military planning. I don't know who he thinks he's fooling. He's not fooling the Russian government or military. That is for sure. US officials in August put the number of Ukrainian soldiers killed at 70,000 and as many as 120,000 injured. In terms of Russian losses, Mr. Zelensky said 180,000 Russian soldiers have been killed and tens of thousands more injured. BBC Russian in a joint project with Mediazona, and I've referenced Media Zona many times, this particular project, has established the names of more than 45,000 Russian service people who had died. But it estimates the total number to be greater than that, but not by much. It will be somewhere around 45,000. In February, the UK's defense ministry estimated that 350,000 Russian troops have been killed or injured, and they're just repeating the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. And these numbers are all absolute nonsense if you apply common sense. Reading what the Western media itself is telling you about how Ukraine is outgunned 10-1, how Ukraine is out of arms and ammunition, their equipment is all broken down, they don't have enough shells to fire back at Russian forces. How could they possibly be killing many times more Russians than they themselves are losing in terms of soldiers? It simply does not add up, and that's because it is war propaganda. It's not meant to. It's just meant to give people false hope and give people something to cling onto rather than look at the truth. They're talking about President Zelensky, the US Department of Defense, the British Defense Ministry, all of these different sources giving different numbers. The numbers that I have found to be the most accurate, most reasonable, have been Russian Ministry of Defense numbers. The one time they gave a number in regards to Russian losses, it was very close to the Media Zona, the BBC Media Zona project number. We have to remember that Media Zona is run by anti-Russian opposition. Looking at the battlefield, again, looking at the battlefield, listening to the admissions by the Western media, how badly outgunned and outfought Ukraine has been, looking at the territory Ukraine is losing on the battlefield, does it really seem like they're killing 10 or more Russian soldiers than they themselves are losing? No, they're not. And a lot of the strategies that we hear Western analysts coming up with in regards to how Ukraine can turn things around in 2024 is all predicated on the assumption that Ukraine is actually somehow taking out this huge toll on Russian forces. What if they're not? Because they most likely are not. Are these strategies going to work? And the answer, again, is no. We have other claims by Ukraine in a very similar vein. Here's from Forbes. February 29, 2024. Su-34s are Russia's best precision bombers, which is why Ukraine is shooting them down as fast as it can. And this is regards to all of these jets that Ukraine has claimed to shoot down. If you've been following it, Ukraine has been claiming that they have shot down a Su-34, at least one Su-34 every single day for several days now. There's not been a single photograph or video of any of these planes being shot down. Ukraine cannot even explain how this is suddenly possible, how they are destroying these planes so quickly. This Forbes article says Ukrainian Defense Ministry claims its forces shot down 3 Russian Air Force Sukhoi Su-34 fighter bombers on February 29th, extending an unprecedented streak of aerial kills that allegedly has cost the Russians 13 warplanes in 11 days, 10 Su-34s, a pair of Sukhoi Su-35 fighters, and a rare A-50 radar plane. So is any of this true? Is there any evidence of any of this? And the answer is no, I haven't seen it. Forbes hasn't mentioned it, and the Ukrainian officials claiming this have not provided any evidence at all. But let's just say that it is true. Let's just give Ukraine benefit of the doubt and say that they are actually shooting down all of these Su-34s. This Forbes article admits that at the beginning of the special military operation, Russia had somewhere around 140 Su-34s. In other articles by the same author, they say it's about 150. They claim that there have been anywhere between 24 to 26 Su-34 shot down in total over the last 2 years. And again, these are not verified claims. These are claims from Ukrainian officials and these so-called open source intelligence projects who claim they visually confirm all of these. But if you actually go to their websites and check each claim, you will see that there's nowhere near anything resembling visual confirmation. Most of it is them citing a post they saw on Telegram, a text post claiming that this has happened, or finding someone they claim is a pro-Russian Telegram account and citing them, accounts that I've never even heard of before. It's a very dishonest approach to claiming and counting losses. But let's just say that that's true. They have 140, they've lost 24 to 26. That's around 18%. In the last 2 years, they've lost 18% of these aircraft. They make anywhere between 8 to 12 Su-34s a year. We know that because there's reports like this from Foreign Policy Research Institute, Russia's military industry forecast 2023-2025. They claim between 8 to 12 Su-34s are built every single year. They've only lost 18% of their starting number at 140. They have a lot of these planes to spare. They'll be able to continue operations for quite a while. Now, let's just pretend that Ukraine is shooting down all of these planes. How could this even be possible? It could be a combination of things. Russia using Su-34s along the line of contact more often as part of their operation, taking Avdeevka and pushing back Ukrainian forces since taking Avdeevka. Maybe there's more planes operating, giving Ukrainian air defenses more opportunities to shoot them down. Maybe Ukraine is risking moving more of their air defense assets into the area because the Su-34s are concentrated in this area along the line of contact. Maybe the Ukrainians have developed a new tactic that Russia hasn't adapted to yet. But one thing is for certain, it isn't sustainable. We know that Ukraine's air defense capabilities are diminishing. They are depleting the number of interceptors that they have. The US and its allies cannot provide enough interceptors fast enough. They're also losing the systems themselves. As they bring these systems up near the line of contact, Russia finds them and destroys them. You could see several videos a week of these systems being found and destroyed. Ukrainian air defense capabilities will continue to dwindle. Russia will find a way to adapt to these tactics if this is even happening. And so, no, I don't think that this is sustainable, even if it is happening. I don't think that it's sustainable. That said, only time will tell for sure. Only time will tell for sure. If Russia begins pulling back its aircraft, or we see a significant drop in the use of military aviation along the line of contact, maybe that points to significant losses and Russia needing to pull back to prevent any further losses. If Ukraine is actually shooting down this many planes every single day, sooner or later, some sort of evidence is going to have to turn up. You cannot shoot down 1 or 2 planes every single day and not have any visual evidence at all. In the past, when Ukraine has claimed it has shot down planes, you will even see visual evidence provided by the Russian side regarding this. It's just strange that Ukraine is in such a desperate situation right now. We know that they're lying about other things. President Zelensky claiming only 31,000 Ukrainians have died in the last 2 years. We know that is a lie. If they're lying about that, what else are they lying about? Are they lying about shooting down Russian planes this often? It's something that they can say that gives people a false sense of hope that they don't really need to prove, that a lot of people are just believing, taking at face value, including Forbes. So it's useful in terms of propaganda, and they don't really have to prove it. People will believe it regardless. At the end of the day, though, if they're not really shooting these planes down, these planes are going to continue bombing targets along the line of contact and wearing down Ukraine's military even further, accelerating this process of Ukraine's military defeat, Russia's success on the battlefield, and hopefully a conclusion to this conflict sooner rather than later. And one final issue, this intercepted communication between these German officials, including military officers. This comes from RT, which is Russian state media. Keep that in mind when considering this information. German discussion of attacks on Russia. What has emerged so far? The link to this will be in the video description. You can read it yourself. They're talking about providing these Taurus cruise missiles to Ukraine. They're talking about hitting the Kerch Strait Bridge, also known as the Crimean Bridge. We see Western media sources like this, Daily Beast, which, you know, really be careful believing anything coming out of the Daily Beast. But while they're trying to spin this all as Russian propaganda, they admit that Germany is investigating this. German authorities are investigating whether or not communications were intercepted. So there is no clear denial by Germany claiming that this is fake or fabricated by the Russian side. They're investigating it, so we'll have to wait and see what comes of that. But regardless, these additional Taurus cruise missiles provided by Germany to Ukraine, if they are transferred, are going to make no difference in the overall outcome of this conflict. They're talking about hitting the Crimean Bridge. While it probably will increase the chances of hitting the bridge, transferring them all of these missiles, I've already explained how destroying the bridge completely will make no difference. There is a land bridge between Crimea and the rest of Russia that Ukraine has no capability of cutting. They tried to last year. They failed categorically. There are ports and airports all across Crimea that Russia had used to supply the civilian economy and its military facilities there on the peninsula from 2014 until 2018 when the bridge was actually built, and between 2014 and 2022 when the land bridge was established. So if you destroyed the bridge, cut the land bridge, Russia would still be able to sustain the economy and its military facilities on the Crimean Peninsula. So again, this is a lot of effort for what would essentially be purely a public relations victory. It would not change the outcome of this conflict. I will continue keeping an eye on the situation in Ukraine. I will continue doing regular updates about the conflict taking place there. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do and it helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work, as well as for all of the links that I mentioned in this video. Also in the video description below are ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel or any of my social media platforms that I'm on. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or even if you're just sharing my work with others, getting the word out there. That is all greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.